Introduction. Sophie Matthews was the epitome of success in the bustling city of New York. With an Ivy League education and a stellar track record in the finance world, she had climbed the corporate ladder with ease. At just 28 years old, Sophie was a rising star at one of the most prestigious investment firms in the city. Her career was set. She had the salary, the perks, and the recognition. She lived in a sleek, modern apartment with a view of the skyline, dined at exclusive restaurants, and had the kind of life that many envied. To the outside world, Sophie had everything: wealth, ambition, and a future that gleamed with promise. But beneath the polished surface of her perfect life, there was a longing that no amount of money could fill. Sophie had always believed in love, not just as a fleeting emotion, but as something deeper, something that could complete her, in a way that career success never could. This belief became clearer when she met James, someone entirely different from the men she had dated in the past. He wasn't wealthy, nor did he have the prestige of her high-powered colleagues. In fact, he was an artist, struggling to make ends meet. He lived in a modest apartment in the less glamorous part of the city and worked odd jobs to support his passion for painting. James was the antithesis of everything Sophie had been taught to aspire to. No six-figure salary, no luxury, no status symbols. Their first meeting was almost accidental. Sophie had attended a small art gallery showing on a whim, invited by a friend who was a patron of the arts. As she wandered through the exhibits, she was drawn to a series of paintings that captured the raw emotion of everyday life, the struggles, the beauty, and the simplicity of it all. One painting in particular caught her eye. It was a portrait of a woman, full of vulnerability and strength. It was bold yet intimate, a reflection of the complexities of the human spirit. Sophie stood there for what seemed like an eternity, lost in the brushstrokes and the story behind them. That was when James approached, the artist himself. Their conversation started casually, but quickly turned to a more profound discussion about art, life, and the choices we make. There was something about James, his passion, his sincerity, his view of the world, that captivated Sophie. As their relationship blossomed, Sophie found herself caught in a tug-of-war between two worlds. On one hand, there was the life she had built, a life of comfort, security, and status. Her family was proud of her accomplishments, and her friends admired her success. On the other hand, there was James, whose love for her was genuine, unpretentious, and liberating. He showed her a world where material wealth didn't define happiness, where true fulfillment came from pursuing what mattered most to the heart. Sophie had never felt more alive, but also more conflicted. The contrast between her glamorous, high-paying job and James's humble, unpredictable life became ever more apparent. She found herself increasingly torn. Her career promised a future of luxury and stability, while James offered a life filled with passion but uncertain security. Sophie was at a crossroads. Should she follow the path she had worked so hard to create, or should she take a leap of faith for love, knowing full well the sacrifices it might entail? The choice. Sophie sat in the sleek boardroom, the sound of clinking coffee cups and murmurs of her colleagues filling the air. The meeting was just wrapping up, but her mind was elsewhere. She had been distracted all day, preoccupied by the decision she had been avoiding for weeks. Across town, James was waiting for her at their favorite little cafe, the one with the faded red awning and mismatched furniture that he loved. It was where they had spent countless afternoons talking about everything and nothing, where their love had blossomed. And now, she was about to face a choice that could define the rest of her life. The offer from her company was sitting on her desk. It was everything Sophie had worked for: a promotion to partner, an increase in salary that would make her one of the wealthiest young women in the city, and a future that guaranteed security and success. Her family had been ecstatic when she told them about the offer, and they couldn't hide their pride. It was the culmination of years of hard work, the golden ticket to a life of luxury. Yet, Sophie felt a knot tightening in her chest every time she thought about it. James, on the other hand, was nothing like her colleagues, nothing like the men her family had envisioned for her. He was passionate, but not wealthy. He was spontaneous, but lacked financial stability. He was an artist, someone who lived by his craft and found joy in the simple moments of life, things that Sophie had learned to appreciate over the course of their time together, but never fully understood until now. Their relationship had become a sanctuary, a refuge from the pressure of her corporate world. With James, she felt seen, not for her accomplishments or her status, but for who she truly was. But as much as she loved him, the reality of their situation loomed large. She couldn't ignore the harsh truth. Marrying James meant choosing a life far removed from the comfort and security that her job and her family provided. He could never give her the extravagant vacations, the designer clothes, the penthouse apartment that she had grown accustomed to. He didn't have a fortune to offer, just love. And love, she feared, might not be enough to sustain them in a world that measured success in dollars and status. As Sophie pondered the decision, the weight of her family's expectations grew heavier. Her mother had already begun hinting about wedding venues and luxury gifts, imagining the grandeur of Sophie's life with someone who could match her ambitions. Her friends, too, were eager to celebrate the success she had worked so hard to achieve. It seemed so easy to take the job, marry someone who was equally successful, and live the life that everyone had always envisioned for her. It felt like the safe option, the practical one. But every time she thought about James, her heart pulled her in a different direction. He wasn't perfect, but with him, Sophie felt complete in a way that money could never provide. Their connection was raw, genuine, and free from the constraints of societal expectations. It was a love that didn't promise financial security, but it offered something far more valuable, a sense of belonging and fulfillment that Sophie couldn't find in any corporate boardroom. That evening, as she sat across from James at their cafe, he smiled at her with those soft, understanding eyes. He didn't pressure her. He never asked her to choose him over her career. He simply wanted her to be happy. Sophie knew then, in her heart, what the right decision was. She was ready to let go of the security that her career offered and choose a life with James, despite the uncertainties that lay ahead. "I want to be with you," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. James reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. It wasn't a decision based on logic or practicality. It was a decision based on love, on trust, and on the belief that emotional fulfillment could be more powerful than any material gain. Sophie had made her choice. She would marry for love. And though the road ahead might be challenging, she was willing to take that leap. The struggles begin. In the months that followed her decision, Sophie began to feel the weight of her choice in ways she hadn't anticipated. James and Sophie moved into a small apartment in a quiet part of the city, far removed from the luxurious penthouse she had once imagined herself inhabiting. The space was cozy, but it was a far cry from the polished, high-rise lifestyle Sophie had grown accustomed to. Their days were filled with love, but also the constant stress of living paycheck to paycheck. James's art career was slow to take off, and while Sophie still worked in finance, her heart no longer seemed in it. The spark that had once driven her to the top of her field had dimmed, replaced by a growing sense of disillusionment as she watched the money they had set aside slowly dwindle. Bills piled up, and the reality of their financial situation began to hit her hard. Her once flourishing career had slowed to a crawl. Sophie found it harder to focus on the demands of her job, knowing that each hour she spent in meetings or in the office only pulled her further away from the life she had chosen. The people at work noticed the change. Colleagues whispered behind her back, and her boss grew increasingly frustrated with her performance. Her promotions seemed distant now, as if they were reserved for someone more dedicated, someone who still had the drive to climb the corporate ladder. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she had already made her choice. At home, James, too, struggled. The reality of being an artist in a world driven by money took a toll on his self-esteem. He had never expected riches, but the constant pressure to make ends meet was exhausting. He had to take on multiple side jobs, painting murals, teaching art classes, even designing logos for local businesses to keep their finances afloat. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but he was determined to make it work. Still, Sophie couldn't help but feel the tension between them. They loved each other deeply, but the stress of living in such uncertain financial circumstances began to erode their connection. They fought over trivial things, money, time, ambition, and Sophie felt the pull of regret creeping in. The most painful part of it all was the disapproval from her family. Her mother, who had always been her biggest supporter, now seemed like a constant reminder of the life Sophie had turned her back on. Their phone calls were filled with pointed comments and disappointed sighs. "Sophie, honey, you know we're just worried about you. James is a lovely guy, but he doesn't have the stability you need. You deserve someone who can give you the life you've always dreamed of. He's just an artist. What kind of future does that offer?" Her father, too, had grown distant, his silence more telling than any words could have been. Sophie had always been his shining star, the one who would carry on the family legacy. His disapproval was evident in the way he looked at her now, as if she had failed him. He didn't understand why she had thrown away the future they had all worked so hard to build for her. Even her friends, once so supportive, had begun to question her decision. At dinners, they would speak in hushed tones about Sophie's adventure. "You know, you could have had it all," one of her old college friends remarked. "Why settle for so little when you could be running your own company? You're wasting your potential." Society, too, had its own harsh judgment. People didn't understand how Sophie could choose love over wealth, the practical over the emotional. To them, her decision seemed foolish, an idealistic fantasy that would inevitably collapse under the weight of reality. The world demanded more than just love. It demanded success, status, and security. Without those things, Sophie's choice felt almost like a rebellion, a rejection of everything that defined the world she had once inhabited. As the months wore on, Sophie found herself questioning whether she had made the right decision. The weight of her family's disappointment, the constant financial strain, and the judgment from those around her began to gnaw at her. She had chosen love, but in doing so, she had lost the life she had worked so hard to build. The sacrifices she had made, quitting the corporate world, leaving behind the security of her high-paying job, were beginning to feel like a burden she hadn't fully understood. But in the quiet moments, when she was alone with James, when they were simply sitting together in their tiny apartment, Sophie reminded herself of why she had made this choice. Love, despite the hardships, still felt more meaningful than any paycheck or promotion could offer. Yet the struggles were becoming undeniable. Would love truly be enough to sustain them through all the challenges ahead? Or had she paid a higher price than she had anticipated? The tension builds. The weight of Sophie's decision grew heavier with each passing day. What had once felt like a courageous leap into a new life now seemed like a fragile house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. The small apartment, once a symbol of her commitment to James and their life together, had started to feel like a prison. Every corner seemed to whisper reminders of their financial struggles. The rent, which had seemed manageable at first, now loomed over them like an ever-present threat. Bills arrived with alarming regularity, and Sophie's heart would race every time the mailman delivered another stack of envelopes marked with overdue notices. James was still painting, still hustling to sell his work, but his art hadn't yet brought in the kind of money that could sustain their lifestyle, let alone afford the basic comforts they once took for granted. Sophie had attempted to balance the two worlds, her demanding job in finance and her life with James, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The hours at her firm were long and draining, but when she came home, there was no relief. James was tired, too. His days were filled with odd jobs, each more tiring than the last. He spent less time painting and more time doing whatever he could to keep the lights on. The emotional connection they had once shared was slipping away, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of survival. Sophie wanted to believe that love was enough, but as their financial situation worsened, she couldn't help but feel the pressure building, squeezing the joy out of their relationship. The late-night conversations that once felt intimate now often revolved around money, where it was going to come from, how they were going to pay for the next meal, the next rent check. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Sophie found herself sitting across from James at their kitchen table, the soft glow of the single overhead light casting long shadows on the room. She was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, But there was a deeper exhaustion that she couldn't shake, the one that came from feeling like she was losing herself in the struggle. She had missed several meetings at work, and her boss had noticed. Her career, once a source of pride and excitement, now felt like an anchor, dragging her down as she tried to juggle her life with James. "James," Sophie said, her voice trembling with uncertainty, "I don't know how much longer I can do this. I'm so far behind at work, and you're working yourself to the bone. How much longer can we keep going like this?" James looked up from the small painting he had been working on, his brow furrowing slightly. "Sophie, we're doing what we need to do. It's not forever. It's just a season. We'll figure it out." His words were kind, but Sophie could see the exhaustion in his eyes. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of their reality was suffocating her. Her dreams, her ambitions, seemed so far removed from the life they were living now. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to carve a path for herself in a world that often seemed to value only material success. But now, as the bills piled up and the tension between her and James grew, Sophie was forced to confront the harsh truth. Love, no matter how strong, could not pay the rent or buy them the things they needed to live a comfortable life. The conflict between her values and the pressures of daily life began to tear at Sophie from the inside out. She had chosen love over wealth, but now it felt as though she was sacrificing her own future for a dream that seemed increasingly out of reach. Her family's words echoed in her mind. "You could have had it all. You threw it all away for an uncertain future." Sophie had tried to push their voices out of her head, but they were impossible to ignore. One afternoon, after an argument with James about money, about whether to dip into their savings to cover the rent or wait another week, Sophie found herself sitting alone in a coffee shop, staring at her phone. She had received an email from her former boss asking her to consider returning to the firm. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. It was a lifeline. The salary was nearly double what she made now, and the responsibilities would put her back on the fast track to success. She could have everything she had once dreamed of: a stable, lucrative career, financial security, the respect of her peers, the life her family had always envisioned for her. The thought of going back to her old life, a life she had once rejected, was overwhelming. She had walked away from it for love, but now, as the financial strain and personal toll of that choice took hold, it felt like the life she had rejected was calling her back. Could she really continue down this path with James, knowing that the financial strain was threatening to unravel everything? Or was it time to admit that perhaps she had been naive, that love alone
The price of love. The days blurred together as Sophie struggled to navigate the delicate balance between love and reality. Her choice, once fueled by passion and the hope that love could conquer all, had become a test of endurance. Every sacrifice she made, every compromise, seemed to pull her further away from the life she had once envisioned for herself. The first sacrifices were small but noticeable. The weekends she used to spend at luxury spas or on shopping sprees in Soho were now replaced with late-night painting sessions as James tried to finish his latest commission or with cheap takeout in their cramped apartment. Her wardrobe, once filled with designer clothes, was now dominated by simple, functional pieces. Sophie found herself choosing practicality over style, a constant reminder that the life she had chosen required her to give up the comfort she had taken for granted. Her career, too, was slowly slipping through her fingers. When her boss called to offer her a new, high-profile project, Sophie hesitated before declining. She didn't have the energy to take on more work, and her focus was fragmented. The corporate world, with its demands for efficiency, deadlines, and success, no longer appealed to her. She had made peace with that choice, but the cost of letting go of her once promising career began to haunt her. Each time she saw an old colleague post about a new promotion or a milestone achieved, a pang of regret shot through her. She had once been on the fast track, poised for greatness, but now the only track she was on was one that felt uncertain, and at times too narrow to allow room for growth. The real toll, however, was on her relationships. Her family had always been her biggest supporters, until she chose James. They couldn't understand her decision, and their disapproval was subtle but painful. They no longer invited her to family gatherings with the same enthusiasm, and when they did, their conversations always seemed to come with an undercurrent of judgment. Her mother, once so proud of Sophie's career, now only asked about James's plans and the future Sophie had built with him. "Are you sure you're not making a mistake?" her mother would ask, her voice tinged with concern. "James may be wonderful, but what's the future without a stable foundation?" The questions, though wrapped in love, stung. Sophie couldn't explain to them what she had found in James that made the struggle worthwhile, how his love was something deeper than anything she had ever known. But the truth was that the sacrifice of her family's approval had left her feeling isolated. They had built so much of her identity around success, status, and financial security, and now Sophie felt like a stranger to them. James, too, was beginning to feel the strain of Sophie's sacrifices. She had given up so much to be with him, but he could see it in her eyes, the weariness, the regret. She was still there, still supporting him, still sharing their small life together, but a shadow of doubt had begun to creep into her heart. He could sense the tension in her every time she spoke of the future, every time she looked at their dwindling bank account, or every time she had to turn down a career opportunity. He hated that he couldn't provide more for her. His love for Sophie was unwavering, but he knew it wasn't enough to erase the hardships they were facing. Their conversations, once filled with hope and laughter, had shifted. They no longer spent hours dreaming about their future. Now, they spent more time discussing their mounting bills and what sacrifices they could make next. The love they shared was still there, but it was no longer enough to keep the weight of their reality at bay. James began to withdraw, feeling guilty that he couldn't offer her the life she deserved. Sophie, in turn, tried to reassure him, but her own sense of guilt grew. She had made this choice willingly, but now, as the months passed, she questioned whether it had been worth it. One evening, as they sat on the couch after dinner, James turned to Sophie, his voice soft but serious. "Sophie, I don't want you to resent me for this. I know you gave up a lot for us. For me. I'm doing everything I can, but I don't want to be the reason you're struggling." His words hit her like a tidal wave, a mixture of love and self-doubt that threatened to break the fragile balance they had tried to maintain. Sophie didn't know how to respond. She had chosen love, but now she found herself questioning whether she had given up too much. Was it possible for love to thrive without the support of the life she had known, the security of wealth, the recognition of career success, the comfort of her family's approval? The emotional toll of Sophie's choice became more apparent with each passing day. She felt like she was constantly fighting an invisible battle between the world she had left behind and the life she was trying to build with James. The love they shared was real. Boom. It was also a constant reminder of everything she had sacrificed. The comfort of financial security, the pride of professional achievements, and the ease of family support. These were things she would never regain, and she couldn't help but wonder if she had sacrificed too much in the name of love. In the quiet moments of reflection, Sophie found herself wondering if love, in its purest form, was truly enough to fill the empty spaces left by the comforts of wealth and stability. Would she ever be able to find peace with her decision, or would the sacrifices she had made continue to weigh on her heart for the rest of her life? It was also a constant reminder of everything she had sacrificed. The comfort of financial security, the pride of professional achievements, and the ease of family support. These were things she would never regain, and she couldn't help but wonder if she had sacrificed too much in the name of love. In the quiet moments of reflection, Sophie found herself wondering if love, in its purest form, was truly enough to fill the empty spaces left by the comforts of wealth and stability. Would she ever be able to find peace with her decision, or would the sacrifices she had made continue to weigh on her heart for the rest of her life? Was the moment of truth. She couldn't have both worlds. Something had to give. The offer was there, clear, tempting, and promising a life of stability. But in her heart, Sophie knew what she had to do. The decision wasn't just about career or money. It was about who she was, who she wanted to be, and whether she could truly find happiness in a life that wasn't defined by wealth, but by love. For the first time in a long while, Sophie made a decision for herself. She let go of the offer, closed her laptop, and turned to James. "I choose us," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I choose you." And in that moment, Sophie realized that love, though not easy, was still the most valuable thing she had. Despite the hardships, despite the sacrifices, she had made her peace. The road ahead would be uncertain, but she had made her choice. And for the first time in a long time, that choice felt right. The consequences. In the months following her decision to stay with James and embrace the life they had built, Sophie found herself confronting the long-term consequences of her choice. The sense of relief that came with finally choosing love over wealth was fleeting, replaced by the subtle and, at times, crushing weight of what she had given up. As much as she wanted to believe that her love for James was enough, she couldn't escape the reality that it came with sacrifices. Sacrifices that would shape the course of her life in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. At first, the shift was small, imperceptible even. Sophie still spent her days at a job she didn't love, making enough to get by, but the career opportunities that once seemed so attainable had all but evaporated. Her former colleagues had quickly surpassed her in the corporate world, climbing the ladder with the help of promotions and opportunities that Sophie had turned down in favor of her commitment to James. Invitations to high-profile events and professional conferences, which would have once been a given, were now few and far between. As time passed, Sophie became a distant memory in the corporate world. She began to notice how her friends and colleagues viewed her with a kind of quiet pity, admiring her courage for choosing love over career, but secretly thinking she had made a mistake. The tension in her chest grew heavier with each passing day as she watched people she had once considered peers soar ahead in their careers. There were moments when she would check LinkedIn, seeing former colleagues' promotions, new projects, and rising salaries, while her own profile seemed stagnant. Each time she received an email from her old firm about new job openings or career development opportunities, Sophie felt a pang of regret. Her heart would race, and she would be tempted to call back, to ask if there was still a place for her. But the guilt of her decision, the promise she had made to James, kept her from reaching out. The financial strain also took its toll. Though Sophie and James made it work, the life they lived was one of constant tension. Their small apartment, once filled with laughter and dreams, had become a place of quiet frustration. James's art, though beautiful, was still struggling to find a market. They had no savings, no cushion to fall back on, and every month felt like a tightrope walk. There was never enough to do what they wanted, to take vacations or splurge on small luxuries. Sophie longed for the days when a spontaneous weekend getaway or a nice dinner out were part of her normal life. But now those things felt like distant memories, reserved for a life she had let go of. One day, as Sophie sat at a coffee shop with an old friend from her former firm, she couldn't help but notice how different her life seemed. Emily, her friend, was dressed in the latest designer clothes, talking about her recent promotion and the excitement of an upcoming business trip to Paris. Sophie listened, trying her best to smile and keep up, but inside, a familiar ache began to grow. She had once been part of that world, the world of success, status, and financial security. Now, she felt like a shadow of the person she had once been. "Are you happy, Sophie?" Emily asked, her voice genuinely curious but with a hint of concern. Sophie hesitated. How could she answer that? How could she explain that love was still the most important thing in her life, but that she sometimes felt like a part of her was missing? She wanted to say that she was content, that she had made the right choice, but the truth was more complicated than that. I'm figuring it out," Sophie replied, forcing a smile. "It's just different now. Things are a lot harder than I expected." Emily looked at her with understanding. "I get it. It's brave what you did, But don't you ever wonder what could have been? The question hung in the air, and Sophie didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure if it was the financial instability, the missed career opportunities, or the quiet loss of her former identity that hurt the most. She was no longer the woman who had been on track for senior management. She was no longer the person who had been admired for her ambition and drive. Now she was just Sophie, the woman who had chosen love and was living with the consequences of that choice. At home that evening, James could sense the shift in her. He had seen her talk with Emily, and he could tell from her distant expression that something was weighing on her. As they sat down to dinner, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers gently. "What's going on?" he asked softly. Sophie put down her fork, looking at him with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "James, I don't know if I made the right choice. I love you more than anything, but sometimes I wonder if I gave up too much. I used to be someone who had it all, career, success, the future laid out for me. Now I'm just lost. I'm not that person anymore." James stared at her, his face filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. "I didn't want you to feel this way," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought you were happy here, with me. I never wanted you to feel like you had to give up everything for me." Sophie sighed, her hand slipping away from his. "I am happy, James. I am. But it doesn't mean I don't miss who I was. I miss feeling like I had a purpose beyond surviving. I miss being the woman who could walk into a room and feel proud of what she had accomplished." The conversation hung heavy in the air, both of them knowing that love alone wasn't enough to fill the emptiness Sophie felt inside. She had given up so much for this life with him, and while she didn't regret her decision, the consequences were real and undeniable. She had lost the person she used to be, and though James loved her deeply, Sophie wasn't sure if that would ever be enough to heal the cracks in her soul. Her sacrifice had been made for love, but now Sophie understood that love, beautiful, selfless love, couldn't always make up for the things she had lost. The road ahead was uncertain, but the price of her choice had already become clear: a life of financial instability, missed opportunities, and a quiet, unspoken loss of identity. The reflection. As the days blurred into one another, Sophie found herself retreating into moments of quiet reflection. The sound of rain against the window was often the only noise in their small apartment, a backdrop to the weight of her thoughts. She had made a choice: to follow her heart, to choose love over wealth. And yet, in the stillness of her daily life, the true cost of that choice began to sink in. There were moments when Sophie would catch herself staring into the mirror, barely recognizing the woman she saw. Gone was the ambitious, high-powered corporate professional who had commanded attention in boardrooms. Gone was the woman who had worn tailored suits and polished heels, who had carried the weight of success on her shoulders. Now she was just Sophie, the woman who woke up to unpaid bills, to a job that barely paid the rent, and to a relationship that, while full of love, was also full of financial strain. At times, the bitterness crept in. She thought about the opportunities she had lost, the promotions, the career trajectory that once seemed so certain. The stability and success that she had once enjoyed seemed like distant memories, things she could no longer grasp. When she saw her former colleagues on social media posting about new promotions or vacations, a pang of envy would twist in her chest. She had made a choice, but did it mean she had to give up everything she had worked for? The hardest part, however, was the loss of her own identity. Sophie had once defined herself by her achievements. Her career was not just a job, it was a reflection of who she was, her value in the world. But now, as she sat in the dim light of their apartment, staring at the faded walls, she realized that she was no longer sure of who she was without the title, without the wealth, without the praise. She felt like she had given up a part of herself to build a life with James, a life she loved, but one that often felt unrecognizable. James, for his part, had always been her rock, the one who made зрение, статус и финансовая безопасность были ответами на счастье. Now, she was left to build a new identity, a new sense of self. Not one defined by wealth or power, but by love, sacrifice, and the quiet courage to find meaning in a life that wasn't easy, but was hers. The reflection was painful, but it was also liberating. Sophie was learning to accept the consequences of her choice. It was a journey of self-discovery, one where she was forced to reconcile the person she had been with the woman she had become. The road ahead wasn't clear, and there was no simple answer to her internal conflict. But Sophie understood for the first time that the price of love wasn't just about what she had lost. It was also about what she had gained. She had chosen a life that was far from perfect, but in doing so, she had chosen a life that was real, and for better or worse, that was something she could hold on to. Resolution. As the months passed, Sophie slowly began to come to terms with the life she had chosen. The inner turmoil that had plagued her, the regret, the doubt, the fear of what she had lost, began to fade, not because the struggles disappeared, but because Sophie had learned to accept them as part of the journey. She no longer resented the life she had given up, nor did she mourn the woman she had been. Instead, she found a new version of herself emerging, one that was shaped not by wealth or status, but by the love she had chosen and the sacrifices she had made. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across their apartment, Sophie and James sat together on the couch, side by side. The room was quiet, but there was a comfortable peace between them now, something that hadn't always been there. For the first time in a long while, Sophie didn't feel the weight of her decisions hanging over her. She had made her peace with the life she had built with James and with herself. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Sophie said, her voice soft but steady, "about everything, the choices I've made." James looked at her, his gaze warm and patient. "What's on your mind?" Sophie paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've spent so much time wondering if I made the wrong choice. I've been angry at myself for giving up my career, my financial security. But I've realized that what I've built with you, with us, is worth more than anything I ever had before." James reached out and took her hand, his touch a gentle reassurance. "Sophie, you don't have to justify anything to me. I just want you to be happy." Sophie smiled, the edges of her eyes softening. "I am happy, James. I don't need a big paycheck or fancy titles to feel fulfilled anymore. I just needed to realize that love, real love, doesn't come with a price tag. It's messy and complicated, but it's ours, and that's enough." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Their life was far from perfect, and they had struggled in ways they hadn't anticipated. But Sophie had learned to accept that love, in all its imperfections, was what had truly mattered. The career she had walked away from no longer felt like a loss. It felt like part of a past that no longer defined her. The woman who had once believed success was everything had given way to a new version of Sophie, one who found fulfillment in the quiet moments, in the simple, everyday life she had with James. James squeezed her hand, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Sophie. You've been through so much, and I can see how strong you've become. We're in this together, always." The future wasn't certain. Sophie knew that. They still had bills to pay, dreams to chase, and uncertainties to face. But now, as they sat there in the quiet of their home, Sophie felt a deep sense of peace settle within her. She had reconciled the dreams of her past with the reality of her present. It wasn't the life she had expected, but it was the one she had chosen, and it was enough. In the days that followed, Sophie began to carve out a new path, one where her choices, both big and small, were not dictated by the expectations of others. She focused more on her personal growth, developing skills that aligned with her new sense of purpose. She found herself starting small projects, collaborating with other like-minded individuals, and exploring passions she had forgotten about during her corporate years. And while money was still tight, there was a sense of freedom in knowing that her worth wasn't tied to her bank account. As for James, his art began to find its own voice. Slowly but surely, the small exhibitions they had hosted in their apartment started to gain attention. People began to recognize his work, and commissions started to trickle in. It was a slow climb, but it was progress, and for the first time, Sophie saw a spark in James's eyes that had been dimmed by years of struggle. Their relationship, too, thrived in ways that Sophie hadn't imagined. They had weathered the storm, and the bond they shared had only deepened in the process. The hard times, the sacrifices, had strengthened their connection. They were no longer just two people in love. They were partners, in every sense of the word, learning to navigate life together. The ups and downs didn't feel so overwhelming anymore, because they knew they could face them hand in hand. And while Sophie knew that love alone didn't guarantee an easy life, she understood that it was enough to sustain them through the toughest of times. They had both sacrificed something along the way, but what they had gained, a deeper understanding of each other, a clearer sense of their priorities, was priceless. Sophie's decision to choose love over wealth had in many ways been the most difficult choice she had ever made. But as she looked at James, the man who had stood by her side through every struggle and every triumph, she knew that she had made the right one. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Sophie felt that she had found her place in it. With James, with love, with a life that was entirely their own. Together, they were building something that couldn't be measured in dollars or titles. It was something far more valuable, something rooted in shared experiences, sacrifices, and the unwavering belief that love, in its purest form, was enough. Conclusion. As Sophie sat on the balcony one evening, gazing out at the city below, the fading light of dusk cast a warm glow across the skyline. She had come a long way since the days of uncertainty and doubt. The path she had chosen had not been easy, but it had been hers, crafted by love, shaped by sacrifice, and made meaningful through the trials and triumphs they had faced together. Looking back, Sophie saw how the tension between love and wealth had defined so much of her journey. She had once believed that wealth was the key to security and happiness, the measuring stick by which success was determined. But now, after all the struggles, the hardships, and the quiet reflections, Sophie understood that the true richness of life was not found in money or status. It was found in the connections we build, the love we nurture, and the courage it takes to live authentically. Her decision to choose love over wealth had been met with challenges she hadn't anticipated. There had been moments of doubt, of second-guessing her choice, when the weight of her sacrifices had felt overwhelming. But through it all, Sophie had learned that love, while not without its own complexities, was worth the risk. She had also learned that wealth, though it offered comfort and security, could never replace the fulfillment that comes from living a life rooted in love, purpose, and authenticity. Sophie's growth wasn't just about finding peace with her decision. It was about discovering a new sense of self. She had let go of the need for external validation and embraced the quiet strength that came from knowing she had chosen her own path. She no longer defined her worth by her job title or her bank balance. She defined it by the love she shared with James, the fulfillment she found in small, meaningful moments, and the understanding that happiness was not a destination, but a journey. In the end, Sophie realized that the complexities of love and wealth were not binary choices. There were no easy answers. The lesson she had learned was that both had their place in life, but love was the anchor that kept her grounded. The sacrifices she had made were not without cost, but they had led her to a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to live with intention. The city before her continued to buzz with life, a testament to the wealth, success, and ambition that filled its streets. But Sophie knew that her path, though different from the one she had once imagined, was one of true richness. She had built a life that was not defined by external markers, but by love, by the quiet, everyday choices to prioritize connection, authenticity, and the courage to follow her heart. And as Sophie and James sat together on the balcony, hand in hand, she realized that love, in all its complexity, was enough. It was all she needed.